Greetings, colleagues, and welcome to the first podcast in a series CNTA is developing around fundamental anthropological concepts relevant to native title. The concepts of local landed organisation are needed not for antiquarian debates, but to help anthropologists researching native title and compensation claims to understand the nature of classical Aboriginal society. In our first podcast and videocast, anthropologist Pascal Taplin and Emeritus Professor Nick Peterson explore the four key concepts relevant to classical Aboriginal local organisation. That is to say, clan and band, and estate and range. One of the key points Nick makes is that the exact nature of these terms for local organisation have a history. Indeed, many of the concepts remained problematic for some decades until Les Hyatt's elucidation in his 1962 Oceania paper, later expanded in his book Arguments About Aborigines, 1996. As a field worker, Pascal asks the important question: what characteristics of local landed organisation and social groupings can we see on the ground? There's also a short paper by Nick relevant to these matters and downloadable from the site, which includes a bibliography of key references. Can I also draw your attention to a recent publication by Peter Sutton and the late Ken Hale, titled Linguistic Organisation and Native Title, the Wick Case, Australia. Here, you will find a very useful chapter, Linguistic and Territorial Organisation, the Wick Classical System, providing inter alia a detailed treatment of the four key concepts from in-depth studies in Western Cape York. I hope you find it useful.
Hi, welcome to this Centre for Native Title Anthropology podcast. I'm Pascal Taplin, an anthropologist working in native title with North Queensland Land Council. In this podcast, I'm greatly privileged to have the opportunity to ask Emeritus Professor Nicholas Peterson a series of questions which tie his paper on local organisation to the experience of in-house anthropologists working in native title representative bodies. You will find Nick's paper via a link on the CNTA webpage. Our intent with this podcast is to assist early career anthropologists working on land tenure issues by profiling concepts in the literature on classical relationships to country. Nick Peterson was a Professor of Anthropology at the Australian National University and is a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. Nick has been with the Australian National University since 1971. Yasmin Mushalbash at the ANU gave an insightful background to Nick in her opening to Ethnography on the Production of Anthropological Knowledge, Essays in Honour of Nicholas Peterson. Yasmin says Nick's longevity at a key nodal point in Australian anthropology, combined with his unflagging enthusiasm for teaching and learning, has seen him directly involved in the training and mentorship of generations of scholars. Reflecting on Nick's 11-year involvement as Director of CNTA since its inception, and the generous time he shares with others like myself who work in the complex world of native title, I would add that Nick has equally invested in the training and mentorship of a generation of applied anthropology practitioners. In the late 1960s, through the course of his PhD research, Nick spent 8 months living with families who are entirely self-supporting. The missionary visited by plane every third week and brought some flour, sugar, tea and tobacco, the imported food only lasting for a couple of days. One of the households had never left the bush permanently. This was one of the last groups living completely off country in Arnhem Land on the southwest corner of the Arafura Swamp, which is more or less 470 kilometres due east of Darwin and south of Milingimbi. This is in the Yolngu area where Lloyd Warner wrote his classic ethnography, A Black Civilization, and where Donald Thompson spent time in the bush between 1935 and 1943. Nick, can we start with the basics? I won't ask you to go over the paper in detail, but for listeners who haven't yet read it, can I get a brief snapshot of the fallout? What's a clan? What's a band? What's the difference? And which owns the land?
Oh, thank you, Pascal, for that introduction. And yes, thank you for having the slide up here. We really need four concepts to untangle the relationship with the land. And they're up on the screen. Clan, which is the landowning group. Estate, the area which the clan owns. And then there's the issue of the land using group, the band, and the area that the band uses to provision itself. The band concept we'll come back to in a minute. Can we see the next slide, please, Pascal? The term clan is rather sort of misleadingly used in the Aboriginal literature, because clans can be either matrilineal or patrilineal. But when we're talking about land, it's always patrilineal in Australia. And so what's happened is that the patrilineal has got dropped in respect of land, just because clan, estate, band, range is sort of rather neat and easy to talk about. But also, people use a wide variety of terminology. They sometimes use, instead of clan, patriclan, patrilineal descent group, patrilineage, lineage, patriline, all of which mean the same thing, referring to the landowning group. And the reasons why people choose one or the other are obviously quite varied. And basically, it's to do with size. I've ranked these terms here in relation to size. Clans are often very big in many parts of the world, more than 400 or 500 people. And in Australia, most clans were probably not much more than 40 or 50 on average. So some people feel that clan's not really appropriate. Probably the most neutral term is patrilineal descent group, but that's a great mouthful. So everybody goes back to using clan, right? And patriline is just a very small group, patrilineal group. Next slide, please. We need to very briefly consider the history of understanding land ownership to understand what the key issues and problems have been. The understanding of Aboriginal land ownership has been dominated by Radcliffe Brown between 1930 and 1962. And he said what everybody agrees with, that everywhere outside of the desert, the arid desert, the landowning group was a clan. He called it a horde. Where he went wrong and where he confused the situation was in his use of horde, because he also used the word horde to describe the land using group. And you can see his definition here of the land using group. The land using group as membership was strictly patrilineal, that is, the men lived on their own land. The only people who moved about were women when they got married, because they went off to live with their husband. And he said there was no provision for changing horde membership. That's a bit unclear. Did he mean clan, or did he mean band, or did he mean both? And when he says the horde was autonomous in managing its own affairs, did he mean the clan? Did he mean the band? And that was the muddle. But nobody realized about this muddle until 1962, when Les Hyatt reviewed the literature, and he said that nobody had ever seen a land using group of the kind that Radcliffe Brown defined, what he called the patrilineal horde, where the basic issue was all men living on their own land, all clan members, male members living only on their own land. Because the literature showed that all of the bands had men of several clans living together. So that raised the question, what was the relationship between the clan and the band? Can we have the next slide? So here's a diagram trying to illustrate the complexity of some of the relationships between land and a man and his land, and it would apply equally to women. If we say that the man belonged to the Emu clan, then, because that was his father's country, which he inherited from his father, that would be his clan country, his clan estate. And these square areas, each rectangular areas, each define an estate. Now, he would have links to his mother's country, the Rain country, and that would be his matrifilial or matrilateral country, often referred to as the country which he has a managerial relationship. And he might also have a relationship with the Bat estate because he was conceived there. Maybe his parents had been visiting at a ceremony or doing something there. And he would also have a relationship with the Frog estate because the Frog ancestor had traveled around, not staying just within the Frog estate, but had gone to the Emu estate and passing through the Rain country and coming back through the Bat estate. So that there were a whole lot of links set up by the traveling ancestors. Could we have the next slide, please? So we can say one man's totemic identity, his patrilineal group interest is Emu clan, Emu dreaming, his matrifilial interest is Rain, his conception interest is Bat, and his dreaming track interest is Frog and Emu travels, linked by the travels of Emu and Frog. Now, the issue of the relationship between clan and band is relatively easily sorted out. The main reason why men of more than one clan live together is because young men have to do bride service. So when they got married, they went off and lived with their wife in her country and with her mother and father. And they might do that for up to 2 or 3 years. And we know that from genealogical and other ethnographic information throughout Central Australia and Northern Australia. It's not quite so clear in settled Australia, where of course the ethnography is not quite so good. So that is obviously not the only reason people from other clans live together. Sometimes a man had killed somebody and it was wise for him to live quite some way away from his own country. So, and there may have been other reasons why people chose to live elsewhere. The more complicated question, oh, could we see the next slide? Sorry, please. And this is a slide of the estates, the clan estates in the Kakadu area. And the main point about this map is they're dividing up the whole landscape. So notionally, there were boundaries, but of course there weren't straight boundaries, and nobody worried about boundaries in the sense that a surveyor was concerned without boundaries. But conceptually, the whole landscape was divided up. Next slide, please. The more complicated relationship is the relationship between the land owned, the area of the state, which is represented here by the rectangles, and the range, which is the area that a band used to support itself day to day. Now, Radcliffe Brown assumed that they were more or less congruent. Obviously, the range wouldn't be absolutely identical with the estate, because there'd be some areas that weren't any good for food collection or production and were rarely visited. The problem is that it's clear that the estate and the range weren't always congruent. So that raises the question, what was the relationship between estate and range? And one can think of a whole lot of possibilities. One might be that there were two ranges in one estate, and another one is that the range had no relationship with the estate, and there could be a wide variety of non-congruent relationships. So this is the more complicated kind of relationship. And I think we might come back to that later on, partly because, of course, the issue of the band and the issue of the range are not really enormously important in native title, but of course they are crucial in understanding the pre-contact classical land owning situation. So we'll come back to that issue about the detail of the estate and range later on. So that's the sort of preliminary background, the four concepts: estate, clan, range, band, and how they relate to each other. So over to you, Pascal.
Nick, just back to the relationship of the clan and the estate. What makes this relationship one of ownership? Could you perhaps provide a few examples from your experience of how that ownership might be realised in a person's lived experience?
Yes, ownership in a sense is really a kind of folk concept. And what's happened in anthropology as a result of land claims and native title is we've all got more and more drawn into using a legal kind of terminology and rightly talking about rights and interests. And that nothing particularly wrong with that, except that it over formalizes some of the kind of relationships that people had pre-colonially. But the main thing, of course, the first thing is that the people who are accepted as having a right to speak for the country are the senior members of the clan, particularly the senior male members, but senior women can have authority too. Classically and pre-colonially, of course, most elderly women weren't living on their own country. They were living with their husbands on their country. So they weren't around to speak about their country, because after males had done bride service for a number of years, 2 or 3 years, they generally left living with their wife's people and went back to their own country. And it was the ambition of most men to live on their own country and certainly die on their own country. Right? And that's where their authority was at a maximum, because they were the people who could control the use of the country. They were the people who went out and greeted visitors, and there were always elaborate greeting ceremonies everywhere. People, and I've been through them myself in the bush, when you people came to visit a band, they tried to announce their presence by lighting fires before they arrived. They would sit down in view of the camp, but not in the camp. And after some period of 10 or 15 minutes, somebody from the camp, a senior male, would come out and sit down with the people, share cigarettes today, talk maybe for an hour or two, and then the visitors would get invited into the camp area, and with that sort of invitation, they then get accepted into the group and have access to the same range that everybody in the group is using to provision themselves, access to the food. So they controlled the access of visitors to the range. They controlled the use of special resources. If there was a red ochre source or a stone source or a source for spear shafts, people couldn't come and just take it. They had to come and ask the senior owners. And of course, the senior owners had the right to hold ceremonies associated with the country, which were in a sense their title deeds. And then in addition, they would like and expected to be buried in their own country too. So those would be some of the main ways.
And do you think the clan remains a contemporarily relevant group? And as an anthropologist working in a NTRB, am I ever likely to see a clan in action?
Pre-colonially and even today, you're unlikely to see every single member of a clan in one group, right? Because even when I was living in the bush with people, you know, old and sick people don't turn up if they happen to be away. There are all sorts of reasons why everyday reasons why not every single member of a clan might not turn up for a ceremony being held by the clan. So, but yes, clans are absolutely integral everywhere to land ownership. And you are likely to see them more clearly in remote Australia, where the fewer people have been fathered by non-Aboriginal people, because obviously that disrupts the patrilineal descent. But if you go anywhere in Arnhem Land in Central Australia and see ceremonies, you'll see members of a clan doing things together, but not necessarily all members, some members of a clan doing things together, quite often, yes.
Nick, native title inquiries go to the laws and customs by which people hold connections to the areas under claim. Would you say that the laws and customs relevant to native title inquiries are those that frame the connection between classically a clan and its estate, or do we need to make a broader sweep?
I think the connections between people and the country were in the past more complex than they are today. As we saw in that example of one man's totemic identity, the patrilineal interest can survive and be important. The matrifilial and matrilateral connections can be important. We've all got mothers and fathers, right? But the ones that are not really quite so strong and are vulnerable are conception links, because most people are conceived in more or less the same place in a town or an Aboriginal village, and that discounts it. They're not out scattered across the landscape as they would have been. And further, another problem is that most people have been buried in cemeteries, so that although for a period in the Northern Territory, people have been able to be buried back on country, and I don't know about other states, so that the rights that come from, or the ability to make claims on the basis of where your relatives are buried has also gone for people. And the more you move into settled area, the more difficult it is for people to make claims against an estate, because people don't have the knowledge of the estates. Their knowledge of links to country are not so fine-grained, and they are dissolved and become much wider and linked to a language generally, rather than to an estate. But nevertheless, the relationships with mother's country remain very important for people. And where people have an Aboriginal father, that relationship's absolutely key. And then, of course, in settled Australia and in remote Australia too, like the Katherine region with Jawoyn people, the language boundary and language area may be the way in which people now relate to country, given that the estate relationships have dissolved because people haven't been living on the country for a very long time.
So in native title claims work, from time to time, we're required to geographically define or delimit native title claims or work with groups to negotiate boundaries between claims. In those areas where the information about classical estates is remembered, in your experience and in the most general terms, would you say that it's probably most logical to configure a native title claim around a cluster of estates?
I think probably the majority of native title claims are defined by the areas of alienated land around them, right? That is, by the boundaries imposed by European take-up of land, and that's recognized under European law, Australian law, so that one isn't actually facing that question in the kind of way you put it, right? But in theory, as we saw from that Kakadu map, in theory, you might define an area in terms of a set of estates, right? But of course, most estates in most areas haven't been well mapped, right? Mm. And so you wouldn't really know where the boundaries were unless you've done a huge amount of work, right? And in some ways, the European imposed boundaries actually simplify that matter, because they're fixed and non-negotiable, and they give you some finite area to deal with, even if the interests of the Aboriginal people spread over those boundaries into alienated land, right? Mm. Or into land that they can't claim or in any way at all, right? So, but in theory, yes, it would be a group of estates.
Nick, in some of the places I've worked, informants talk about the run of their old people. So, you know, old Nick's run might have been between place X and place Y. And perhaps in some claims, the evidence suggests that our informants are describing a range, and that the range is now fondly remembered amongst the claimant group and has significance. Do you have a view or experience to share about whether, and if so, how, a range might figure in the geographical definition of a native title claim?
That's a difficult one. I think, just generally speaking, I don't think ranges are relevant to most native title claims. I think it's very important to make a distinction between the range of an individual and the range of a band. So we come back to this issue of band and range. Now, a band is a collection of 2 to 6 households in most of Australia. It might have been a bit bigger in settled Australia, you know, Victoria, New South Wales, but there's not really good evidence in it. on it, that matter. And they live together, and but they don't necessarily, and they provision themselves from the same space. That's the range which they provision themselves from. But they don't do it as a group. They do it as individual households. Right? That's quite clear that the band isn't a foraging group. The band is an occupant of a space, right? A group of people who occupy an area. And I mean, the concept of range is really an outsider's concept, right? If you imagine in 1788 being able to hover with a helicopter over an area for a whole year and just drawing a circle around the space that people use in their everyday provisioning themselves, right? That group of households supporting themselves. Of course, many people in that band might, as individuals or even a family, go way outside that range for a ceremony or to go and visit other relatives. And the concept of range is really based on efficient use of the land, economic use. So, I mean, if you think of one's own life, if two neighbors in a street are likely to use the same supermarket, the same chemist, and the same shopping center that's nearby, I mean, you can think of cases where they won't, but they do that. They might go elsewhere in our society because the costs of travel are very low. That driving in a car, the petrol costs are very little, and the ease of travel. But if everywhere you have to expend your own energy walking to get to the food supply, then people who live with each other together in a band will work the same space and will be minimizing the amount of distance that they have to travel. That's why the band moves its camp 5 or 6 times a year to get to a new area where they're A, seasonal resources, and B, they reduce the amount of movement that they have to do to get to those resources. But as far as somebody telling you about their grandfather going on a beat or a line or a run, I think that would be important in terms of showing familiarity with the country and showing connections between groups. But it wouldn't be the basis for, I would have thought, any substantial claim to an area. And of course, yeah, no, I think it wouldn't. And people on beats and runs where they're documented, like by Jeremy Beckett in Western New South Wales or Chris Birdsall in Western Australia, show that they're traveling over very large distances. You know, it's far further than their people would have walked in the past.
Sometimes we find that within a single native title claim, certain families are connected to certain focal areas, or in places I've heard them called homelands within a bigger claim area. Assuming that, you know, there's evidence that these associations aren't historical but are of considerable antiquity, are we necessarily looking at contemporary reflections of classical estates, or is it possible that these are different types of areas and it's a different type of relationship?
Okay, well, that's actually a very complicated question if you wanted to explore it to its full extent. But residence is the essence of the classical system of relationships to land, right? And the way that sort of long-term residence over generations gets recognized. And with our legal language, and we've kind of over-formalized the kind of things in a way. So I think, in a sense, people who claim that they've got a particular connection to an area post-colonially are probably not referring to an estate in that way, because in many situations, the group that's making the claim would be more like a family of polity, or a small family of polity, or maybe even a big one, right? And their connections to country would be quite complicated if they still had memories of them, but they were likely to involve people who would have been from several patrilineal descent groups if they'd had Aboriginal fathers, right? So, no, what they're reflecting is long-term residents as a result of colonization, working on a cattle station, and having been there for several generations and identifying with that place, or having been in a small country town over generations, you know, in that sort of way, and coming to identify with it, having a historical relationship. But I don't think it would, it doesn't go back to the estate in any formal way, and I don't think it's some other kind of unexplored type of link that existed pre-colonially that we need to recognize. But it's a basis for a strong historical claim, obviously, yes.
Nick, getting back to bands, in the connection reports I've read, the authors apply an infinite number of different terms to land using groups, almost every possible variation except band. Examples that spring to mind include mobile village or occupation group. I haven't seen the term band used as a standardized technical term in the same way that clan often is. Why has the poor old band sunk into relative obscurity?
I think that's a good question. And I think there are a range of reasons, right? The reason people use bands is that it's widely used in North America, right? And much of the literature on theoretical literature on relationships between people and place came out of the work of Julian Stewart in North America, and he wrote more generally about hunter-gatherers generally, but he used bands. They talk about band society. And so in the 60s, when anthropologists suddenly kind of rediscovered that there were still hunter-gatherers out there who were self-supporting, and that they didn't need to talk to hunter-gatherers on the veranda about what they did, but they could actually go to the Kalahari and spend time with the Kung and find out what, you know, actually go hunting and gathering with them. Then the whole band language came back from the work of people like Richard Lee, and then in North America, in Canada, and the US, in administration of indigenous groups, they talk about bands too, and they mean something slightly different from the hunter-gatherer bands, but they're the sort of descendants of the hunter-gatherer bands. So I think that's probably the key reason why the word band is used. And it does sound sort of a bit sort of, I don't know, old-fashioned, but it was very, very important to get away from horde, because that was the source of all of the problems about understanding how land tenure worked. Why didn't men stay living on their own land? I mean, if you've got a system of ownership, does it mean nothing if people are not living on it? If they're living anywhere, it doesn't make them any sense having a system of patrilineal land ownership, right? And one of the things about Les Hyatt's critique in 1962 is he really didn't develop a new generalization about land ownership. He did and in the paper I refer to this, but I don't want to talk about it in detail now. He did suggest that groups of patrilineal clans pooled their land and used it as a community. And so that he was talking about bands about 4 or 5 or up to 10 times bigger than were ever really recorded. And it really confused the situation. His idea of the community never caught on. The only other person who ever used the concept was Meggitt, and it's never caught on, and it makes no sense, right? So it comes from the American literature, and particularly from Julian Stewart. It's important to get away from hoard. We need to use land owning from land using. They've got to be, so we need another term. And the community is not a good one. So you need to distinguish two. If you're walking through the bush and you bump into, pre-colonially, one's talking about, not today, and you came across a group of women and some children, or you came across a man and his wife and a few children, or you came across 2 or 3 men and two or three young boys, none of those were bands, right? They're all foraging groups of some sort, out for the day from the band camp, right? The band is the 2 to 6 households that sleep in the same area, right? That's the band, right? So obviously using a word like a camp is a bit ambiguous. Do you mean the camp of the band? Because sometimes an individual household will go off by itself and camp away from the band camp for 2 or 3 days, right? Maybe it wants to exploit a particular resource. Maybe it's fed up with having too many people around them, or whatever the reason is, right? So is that a band? No, it's a camping group of some sort. So you do need, in the classical situation, a complex terminology, and you do need to have something that's the equivalent of band. But mobile village and makes no sense, all these other things are not, don't make any sense really at all.
So you're suggesting very clearly then that in our connection reports, we should be using the term band for land using groups. Is that right?
Yes, I'm saying that for the band is the residential group occupying an area. It's not necessarily, the band as a group doesn't go out and do anything. The band is a collection of households, and on any one day, each family might go, household might go off by itself. Generally, women from several households might go off together, and men from several households might go off together. Sometimes a man from one household would go off by himself. Women never went off by themselves. But the band as such is the occupant of a range, and the range is an etic, external concept around the area, circumscribing the area that people use day to day, right? So it's not really important in native title, I should emphasize that, but it's absolutely crucial in understanding classical land ownership, right?
And you talk in your paper about ceremonial gatherings, I think, but outside of those ceremonial gatherings in classical systems, were there any other types of land using or perhaps seasonally co-residential groups that can be defined in using different technical or functional terms?
I don't think so. The possibilities would be if 2 bands got together for a fire drive or something, but I've seen fire drives and things, and they're just conducted by 3 or 4 households within a band, right? You know, getting together, saying, oh, cooperating to run a fire drive. So I doubt that there were, that happened very often. You can imagine that if a whale got beached, then people from all over the place might come, and you get members of several bands coming together and feasting on it and things. But in the normal course of events, the only other possibility which the literature raises, and I'm very skeptical about this, is gatherings for trading, right? If you read some of the early literature, they talk about markets, right? But when you look at the literature, mainly what those markets are people exchanging things in the shadow of a ceremony. Lots of people come together for a few days or a week, and there's lots of things going on besides singing and celebrating and dancing and doing things like that. People are meeting up, exchanging things, and that's all very well described by Howitt and other people. And I don't think that people met just to exchange things in big groups, so independently of ceremonial things. So I think really, see, when a resource became super abundant, people would gather there, and that was the basis for having a ceremony. And the issue about ceremonies was that they were the manifestation of the polity, the regional political unit. So people came together, and as the literature makes clear, when large numbers of people come together, the first thing they do is go through dispute settlements, right? And then so that they can spend the next week or whatever it is they are together without fighting with each other, right? And collaborating in ceremonial activity. And so they sort of bond over the period of the ceremony, which is generally not more than 2 weeks, right? And then resources roundabout start to run out, people having to walk too far to get food, and kangaroos and things have disappeared. So everybody disperses and goes back home, right? Then over the next, 12 months, the polity in some way often deteriorates. Somebody steals somebody else's wife, or, on a visit, or, is thought to have abused somebody else's sacred patrimony in some way, and then the kind of conflicts break out. But then in the subsequent year, or maybe 2 years later, at the time of some other superabundant resource, there's some father who wants to initiate his sons or stage a ceremony to elevate their religious education. He organizes a ceremony on that superabundant source. Everybody comes together, and the polity renews itself. And it's not exactly the same group of people who was there 2 years before, but it's roughly the same catchment. And so it's a highly dynamic thing.
A band is a technical term that perhaps might preoccupy only anthropologists. If we're to look at a band from an emic perspective, did bands anywhere in your experience share a group identity? Nick, have you come across instances where bands are or were named? And
I think it's a bit difficult to separate out the naming of a band from the naming of the occupants of an area, right? So there are lots of kind of regional naming, and often people might say the swamp people, or the backcountry people, or the open forest people, right? And referring to possibly more than one group of occupants of an area. But even if they're referring to only one group, whether they're referring to the clan in that area, or whether they're just referring to the people who they know are there at the time, would be, I think, entirely context dependent, right? I mean, people are very clear where other people are living in the landscape, or where groups are. They may not know exactly who's in the group, because people did a lot of visiting. That's absolutely clear. And people were doing bride service, people going off to ceremonies, people going off for individual reasons, maybe to exchange things or get hold of resources from somewhere else as individuals or a family. So there was constant in and out from a band composition. And generally what held them firm was one or two older men who were living on their own country. And because they were older, they were less mobile. In fact, they often didn't hunt or gather at all, because they had several wives. They often had young sons, or they had sons-in-law all supporting them, right? And so they were anchored by wanting to live in their own country, in their own area. And so the dispersion of the population across the countryside was well known to people, right? Not exactly whether they'd be at point A or point B, but they know they'd be in that general area. So when they're referring to the population, oh, there's the people over there are the swamp people, you'd want to know the context in which they were talking about them, as to whether they were referring to them as a clan. Or so that ending where you see, I think, borough, you see a lot, don't you, up in Queensland? They put
Indeed, yes.
Yes, I think that's a sort of geographical reference, right, to the people occupying it. But sometimes in the context, it could be a specific reference to the TOs for that area, the clan for that area. This is one of the two bands I worked with in Arnhem Land, and it is formed around two brothers, Baiman and Dulatarama. And Baiman is the man with the clapping sticks in the middle of the picture, and his brother is over on the right with his knee up and his arm underneath his knee. And they're Ritangu speakers, and they've lived on their country all their lives and never moved out of it in any permanent way at all. And I've just arrived from a neighboring band with this man who's got his back to us sitting on the blanket, and he's brought information about the death of somebody. And so everybody's gathered, or not everybody yet, but the old man has gathered, Baiman, and is starting singing in memory of the dead person. And his eldest son is playing the didgeridoo. And 4 of the boys sitting next to him are his other sons. And 2 of the other boys are his grandsons through his daughter. And the old man, who you can't really see over on the right, but is behind Dulatarama, he's there because his son is doing bride service to Baiman and Dulatarama. The son is married to one of their daughters. And so the father, a very old father who's very infirm, needs a lot of looking after. He's come to have his son look after him as well. So there we have men from 3 clans. We have the Ritangu traditional owners who anchor the band in place. We have the son-in-law who's not in the picture, but his children are, 2 of his children are. And then we have the father of the son-in-law who's come along. He's the same clan, obviously, as his son, but he's there because his son's there and he's looked after. And there are about 3 other huts in this band camp. So this is a fraction of a band camp. Individuals go off during the day from it, but in the evening, everybody is back here sleeping, talking, eating, and staying the night.
And Nick, the fellow you travelled with from the neighbouring band, is he sitting on the tarpaulin? Is
Yes.
Is his father's country next door?
No, he's of the same clan as these people. He actually lives in the mission, and he used to live out in the bush, but one of the reasons he lives in the mission is he had leprosy, and he spent a long time in the leprosarium, and he needs, minimal medication. I camp with him for weeks at a time, but he mainly prefers to live in the mission now because he can't walk very well. He's losing his toes and lost some of his fingers, right? But this is the same country, and if he were living in the bush, he'd be probably living with this band, yes.
And I'll just leave that picture up there because it's so lovely. But I notice in your paper, you use the term "is" in your definition of band. In your experience, is band a concept that remains relevant contemporarily? And as an anthropologist working in an NTRB, am I likely to observe groupings or social behaviour which I could either technically or in an abstract way relate to the type of bands photographed here?
No, I don't think so. I think for a band to have meaning, I think it has to be people living together, being totally self-provisioning in the bush and living off the bush, because the band is very much, its composition and location in space is influenced by the fact that it has to self-provision itself, right? So an outstation group isn't a band because they often have cars and roads and live out of the shop as well as hunting and gathering, right? Often the composition of outstation groups reflects people doing bride service and is probably relatively similar to a band in many cases, but they're not bands because I think it's only useful to use that term where people are fully self-provisioning themselves.
Shall we move on to a discussion about succession?
Right, okay. Look, succession is very important. Succession is used in a slightly odd way in Aboriginal land tenure because the obvious succession is from father to son and daughter and then passed on through the male line. But succession doesn't refer to that. Succession refers to when land is passed on not through the male line because the male line has died out. Now, it's clear that before Europeans arrived, there was succession going on. And the reason for this is that the Aboriginal patrilineal landowning group, the clan, was on average quite small, only 40 people. And that was vulnerable to demographic fluctuation, that because of sickness, because some people died early, because some women only had female children, some people might have been killed in fighting, etc. Sometimes some clans died out. On the other hand, some clans, and you can see this one in particular, are set for a big expansion because Baiman and Dulatarma had a lot of sons between them. So if they manage to find wives, they're likely to have lots of children and probably lots of male children. So what we find is that over generations, and we're talking about 3 or 4 generations in the classical system, some clans contracted and eventually died out, and some clans expanded and eventually split and became 2 separate clans because there were so many people that the clan members were dispersed among different residential groups, different bands in different ranges. So the sort of hypothetical situation is that a man goes to do bride service with his father-in-law. His father-in-law is the last person of the clan there. The son-in-law goes when he's quite young, he's 30. His father-in-law lives to a ripe old age. The son-in-law stays on helping. Maybe they get on well. And so he comes to be knowledgeable, and not only about the country, but about the ceremonial and ancestral knowledge connected to the country. And so when the father-in-law dies, instead of leaving to go back to his own country, he just stays on because he's totally familiar, he likes it, his children have been born there, they've been conceived on the country, they think of it as home, they've grown up there, they start to think of it as their land. Now, in an oral society, and given the Aboriginal, that Aboriginal people don't value long genealogical memory. That's a cultural choice that they've made in some way. That there's only really go back a couple of generations from people in their 60s. Then over 3 or 4 generations, it's quite easy for people to, in effect, erase the memory of the original clan and for somebody else to take it over the country. And that can happen either, in effect, the people, the son-in-law, who's now living on his old father-in-law's country, and his male descendants change their clan identity, or they claim the country as belonging to their own, the son-in-law's own original clan. And they can make claims to the country on the basis of having been conceived there, being knowledgeable about the ceremony, being on the same linked as ancestral track, and on a number of other bases. And succession has become absolutely fundamental to land claims and native title, because colonization has disrupted the demography and meant many landowning groups dying out, and so the whole succession process explains how they come to be traditional owners for country for which there are no patrilineal descendants from the very original people. And all of this is slightly obscured, particularly in remote Australia, by the insistence on an ideology of no change, an unbroken connection to the past. What has muddled the whole thing up and made succession a matter of dispute is firstly that we write things down and that fossilizes them. And second, that succession took place over 3 or 4 generations, but we want it all to take place in a year during the formulation of a native title claim or a land claim. And that forces people to make their claims to be the right people to take over a country, especially when they're a long way from it, as they are today, often living in towns or villages. And it forces disputes into the open. And that makes for difficulties, which many of you are dealing with.
So I think you've answered this question in your scenario with the son-in-law resident in the band. But just to be clear then, processes of succession in classical systems were not always ones in which an entire clan succeeded to an entire estate.
Absolutely. No, I think that's really an important, it's basically in most cases, it would have been an individual living there, and in fact switching clans, or if he stayed, his relatives stayed in the same clan identity over 2 or 3 generations, starting to say, oh, we're a bit different from those people who call it the same clan. We, you know, oh, they are our relatives, but we're different. You know, they're a little bit long way from us. Fission, we get fission and fusion in kinship systems all the time, right? And so, but what has been well documented, particularly post-colonially, is group succession. And that comes when whole groups have died out through disease, through fighting, through being murdered by the colonizers. And then one group may succeed to a whole neighboring language group area. And that's been documented particularly well by David Trigger in the Wanye area, and Peter Sutton has references to group succession. I think he calls it conjoint succession in his book, and has a number of other examples where a whole language group has succeeded to another language group's country. It's where the old estate system started to fall away, or where a whole group has been wiped out. Yes, so it's not generally a clan in the classical system. Today, it's more like to be a group succession. Yeah.
I don't have any more questions. And I have any thought in how to end this?
No, I have. Well, look, I'd like to say thank you very much for reading the paper I wrote so closely, Pascal. You read it very closely and have asked a lot of questions that sort of bring out a whole lot of issues that I didn't make completely clear in the paper. And so you've greatly added to its help to other people by clarifying so many issues. So thank you very much.
Thanks, and thanks for the opportunity to ask all these questions, Nick. It's been wonderful. It's been a great privilege.